My guest today is Bobby Shackouls. Bobby, could you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Hi, Tom. It's great to be here. I'm have a chemical engineering degree from Mississippi State University, but I only got one job offer when I was coming out of school, and that was to be a reservoir engineer for Humble Oil and Refining, which is now ExxonMobil. So I basically was retrained as a petroleum engineer by Exxon. And then I've had several jobs throughout the industry over the years, but it's been 52 years now in this business, and it's been great.
Okay, and I've read up on you, and to me, it seems like you've been everywhere and you've seen everything and you know everybody. Is that a fair assessment?
I don't know if I know everybody, but I know a lot of people, and I've been a lot of places.
Let's open with the thing we just talked about Jennifer Granholm. What happened with you and Jennifer?
Well, I served on the National Petroleum Council. I don't know how much you know about the National Petroleum Council, but it was formed in 1946 by President Truman to advise the federal government on matters relating to oil, gas, and coal. Because if you really think about it, World War II was fought over energy and the access to crude oil and thusly gasoline to run the machinery of the war. I became a member of the National Petroleum Council in 1997, and then I served as chairman for a couple of years, and then continued serving on the council until April of 2 years ago, 2022. And I got this letter from Secretary Granholm, and it was I didn't understand it. So I called the executive director of the National Petroleum Council and inquired as to what it meant. And he said, it means you're no longer a member of the National Petroleum Council. So I sent her a letter back along with 2 books, because in my view, the policies of this administration are very damaging to our economy, to our citizens, to everybody concerned. And I expressed that concern and sent her 2 books authored by Alex Epstein. And I never heard a word back from her.
So do you think that Jennifer has any idea of how energy is produced in this country, what runs our economy, anything about that stuff?
Well, I've told a lot of people that, in my view at least, she's just like all the other predecessor energy secretaries, which is they knew nothing about energy. The possible exception to that is Rick Perry, who served under President Trump. And that's only because Rick grew up in Texas and we beat it into him.
So do you think, though, that her idea is that hydrocarbons cause bad weather, so the thing to do as secretary is to fight them? Is that it?
Well, they talked a lot about this energy transition, which is really going nowhere. If you look at the electric vehicle industry, it's in the doldrums, and people are now saying they're going back to internal combustion engine cars. And what happened this past week with the debate and then the 2 rulings that came out the day after, in my view, that must have been the worst 24 hours for the Democrats that they've ever seen, because it really throws a wrench in their energy transition process and all of the rules and regulations that they've tried to promulgate, to mandate electric vehicles, to outlaw oil and gas, to slow down the federal leasing program. I just read a thing from Tim Stewart, the U.S. Oil and Gas Association, where the Biden administration has now crossed 200 items of executive orders or rulemakings or things like that that are designed to slow down the oil and gas industry.
So what do you think is a general feeling within the industry, oil and gas industry? Are people at all buying into the whole climate scam, or they know obviously that it is a scam and there's no reason to fight carbon dioxide?
Well, I think that people more and more are buying into the idea that we're nowhere near peak demand for hydrocarbons, because there are 8 billion people in this world that live on less than what an American refrigerator uses in terms of energy per day. So consequently, I think people are coming around to the idea that oil and gas is going to be around for a long time, that EVs have to stand on their own, that this whole concept of eliminating carbon dioxide, which my friend David Blackman calls plant food, is sort of a myth. In fact, there's absolutely no correlation between the Earth's temperature and carbon dioxide concentrations in the atmosphere over 4 billion years of geologic history. So consequently, I think that notion is starting to take hold.
Do you think ESG is still a big deal within the major players in the industry? Because you sent me some stuff about a guy named Hildebrand from Hillcorp who is picking up assets for cheap because since it's a private company, he doesn't have to worry about ESG. Do you think that will continue, that private companies will take over these assets?
Well, I think the natural progression for these types of assets, and in particular, Jeff Hildebrand has acquired a bunch of assets in Alaska, and the Prudhoe Bay oil field was discovered the year that I came into the industry, and it is reaching its final years. And what happens is these larger companies like ExxonMobil and BP, the prior owners of Prudhoe Bay, as those fields decline and they start to approach the need to plug and abandon them and restore the land to its natural existence, it makes more sense for smaller companies to do that instead of the larger companies. And I think that's what's actually driving that type of acquisition, is the need for the bigger companies to let the smaller companies milk the last few drops of hydrocarbons out of the ground and then plug and abandon the assets.
So you sent me a letter or told me that they are injecting billions of cubic feet per day of natural gas back into to the ground up there. That's because they don't have a market for it and they just have to get rid of it somehow?
Yeah, that's because that reservoir is what's called a solution gas drive reservoir. So as the pressure in the reservoir declines, the amount of gas goes up, and there is no market. There's only a 48-inch oil line leading from Prudhoe Bay. I think it goes like 900 miles or something like that. It's called the Trans-Alaska Pipeline, but it's crude only. So the only thing that they have to do with the gas is to re-inject it for two reasons. One is because there's no market, and two, to support the reservoir pressure and increase the amount of crude oil production over time.
So is there any chance that there could be a market for that gas in the near future and like a decade from now still, or no?
Well, there's been a lot of talk about building an LNG facility there and exporting the gas that way. There's also been talk about laying a gas pipeline to the south that would parallel the crude oil pipeline. But I don't see either of those things happening anytime soon.
Okay. Another thing that you mentioned is that you knew the CEO of Exxon at the time of the Exxon Valdez, or he talked later about that maybe? What did he say about that?
Yeah, his name was Larry Rawl. He was a great gentleman. Unfortunately, he's no longer with us. But Larry told me not too long before he passed away that the worst mistake he ever made in his whole career was not getting on the airplane and flying to Alaska just to let people know that he cared about the Exxon Valdez accident.
Do you have a sense as to how long the environmental damage lasted from that? Did it kind of clean itself up naturally after a while?
Yeah, in fact, I don't know. I don't think I've mentioned this to you. There was a book written by the governor of Washington, and it was called Environmental Overkill. Her name was Dixie Ray Lee, I believe. But basically, it told the story of when World War II broke out, German U-boats patrolled the east coast of the United States, and they sank tankers. And the crude oil from those tankers actually washed ashore along the states of Virginia, North Carolina, all along the eastern seaboard. And because we were consumed with fighting the war, nobody paid much attention to it, and it cleaned itself up over time, and there's no evidence of it anymore. And so consequently, the Exxon Valdez accident was a terrible thing, but the lasting environmental impact of it has been minuscule.
Aren't there natural oil seeps off the coast of Santa Barbara to this day, where oil is just coming out of the ground underneath the ocean? I guess, or isn't that
Yeah,
true?
have you ever been on a beach where the tar balls?
I've
Uh,
not.
in Texas, there's tar balls everywhere. And that's happening is you have oil seeps out in the ocean. The oil rises to the top, floats on top of the water, and then gets washed ashore. And the same thing happens in Santa Barbara. So yes, there are natural oil seeps everywhere, and where the oil is actually escaping from underground reservoirs and making its way to the surface.
So are people pointing at those tar balls and saying, "Look, the oil industry did this"?
Yes. Yes, that's exactly right. I think I told you the story about when I was chairman of NPC that the government was considering lease sale 181, which is up on the panhandle of Florida. And we were trying to convince the senators from Mississippi, Louisiana, Alabama, and Florida that they should let lease sale 181 go forward because most of the leases that were being sold were prone to find natural gas rather than crude oil. And the reason we knew that is there had been some early wells drilled in an area called the Destin Dome. Trent Lott was the senator from my home state, was also the Senate Majority Leader at the time, stopped me in the middle of my presentation and said, "Young man, given the choice between energy independence and the white sand beaches of Destin, the people of Florida are going to choose the white sand beaches every day." And I responded, "Well, Senator, I think they can have them both." And he just went off on the Exxon Valdez. And my response to that was, "Senator, I don't believe, at least to my knowledge, there's ever been one drop of natural gas spilled on any beach in the world." And he started badgering me again about it because he thought I was talking about gasoline rather than natural gas.
Do you think that in the U.S. we have some politicians who understand the difference between natural gas and gasoline? I hope.
Yeah, we have a few. I think Ted Cruz understands it.
Okay, good to know. Let's talk about some of your other brushes with fame. Like you've hung around or played golf with Warren Buffett, right?
Yeah, I actually played in the Warren Buffett charity tournament, which was held for 10 years in a row. The very last one was on Tuesday, September 11th, 2001. And that was a very, very interesting day because if you remember, President Bush flew into Omaha to get a briefing in the underground bunker there. And we actually saw Air Force One coming in with fighters on each wing. It was quite an impressive sight. But yeah, I played in the last 5 of those tournaments in Omaha. My de facto lead director was a guy named Walter Scott, who was one of Warren Buffett's best friends, and he served on the Berkshire Hathaway board. And through that relationship, I got invited to play in that tournament and met a lot of wonderful people there.
Do you have any sense at all as to whether Buffett himself believes in the climate scam or how much he knows about the whole thing?
You know, I have never actually discussed it with Warren. I have a suspicion that Walter did. My guess is he probably doesn't have a view one way or the other. Because if you think about his businesses, one of which is the ownership of the Burlington Northern Santa Fe Railroad, runs off diesel fuel. And it makes absolutely no sense to electrify the diesel engines that carry goods all over this country. So consequently, I have to believe that Warren understands how this all works and buys into it.
Yeah, I mean, I've carefully watched what he said and listened to him on video. He has invested in fossil fuel and hydrocarbons, and he says about wind energy that no one would invest in it unless there were subsidies. He said something about that. And he said that there's no signal in the insurance industry. There's no signal that the storms are getting worse. He said something along those lines. So it seems like he doesn't want to come right out and say he's an unbeliever. I think he is an unbeliever, but that's what I think.
Well, he says all the right things. I will definitely give him that. And I know that Walter understood the facts, and one of his businesses is called Mid-American Energy, and they burn coal and natural gas to generate electricity in addition to wind and solar and geothermal. But my point is, it's a regulated utility, so consequently, he's in the energy business as well.
You have had some contact with Alex Epstein?
Yes, I am a member of what's called Energy Talking Points, and we meet once a month and get a debriefing from Alex. Obviously, I've read both of his books and read a lot of the stuff that he puts out. I think he's one smart dude. He and his wife were our guest at this year's All-American Wildcatters in Las Vegas, and he participated in a panel discussion on Saturday afternoon. And we were supposed to cover two topics. One was climate, and the second was the energy transition. We never got to energy transition because the whole hour was spent on climate. And he told me before that one of the members of the panel might disagree with him. It was a gentleman from the University of Colorado, and I don't remember his name right now, but he started out saying he disagreed with Alex, and then 5 minutes later he agreed with him. So it was pretty phenomenal.
So was Michael Schellenberger on that panel?
No, Michael Schellenberger was on the panel the year before in Florida, and he was quite entertaining as well. He was on a panel with Warren, I can't ever say his name, but the Swedish fellow.
Bjorn Lomborg.
Or something like that.
Lomborg, yeah.
Yeah, right. And also, I've now gone blank on his name, but the guy that runs Liberty Energy was on that panel as well. But that was an entertaining panel.
Okay, and in general, people are not buying into the climate crisis on these panels you've been on, or as you travel the country. Do you run into people who are all in on the climate crisis very much?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I've run into people that are all over it and believe in it hook, line, and sinker. But the reality is Warren Buffett is right. The storms aren't getting any more intense or more frequent. And as Alex points out, the whole energy equation, which is mostly derived from fossil fuels, has allowed us to better master the climate and predict when it's going to hit.
You've done a bunch of fighting back in real life against this, right? I think presentations in schools maybe, or I think in Colorado, there was some local, they were going to have some sort of policies against climate change, and you sent a letter about that. Or can you tell us about that?
Well, the Colorado thing, there was an ad in the paper here, the local paper, that said they were forming a committee to fight climate change. And so I filled out the application and submitted a letter with it that said, there is no climate crisis. Obviously, the committee was never formed, and I never heard a word back from them. The same thing happened a couple of years before. I was in Vail, Colorado, and I saw this car parked in front of a hotel that said, this is a zero emissions vehicle. And so I wrote the manager of the hotel and told him that that was the biggest false advertising I'd ever seen, because the electricity that car ran on was generated mostly by fossil fuels. And so consequently, those emissions were just shifted from the tailpipe to the stack coming out of the power plant. And I never heard a word about that either. The school thing, when my children were in elementary school and I was working in the upstream business, I gave presentations. The API used to have something called the oil and gas primer, and it was like trying to explain in very simple terms how oil and gas was formed, how we find it, how we produce it, how we refine it. And I used that as sort of a go-by to make presentations to the 5th and 6th graders. But I could tell the teachers didn't like what I had to say. But you know, they just saw me as part of the problem and part of big oil, which I wasn't. But nonetheless, I tried. I've seen examples of really, really good companies take the position that if they just do their job right and provide Americans with affordable, abundant energy, which they view as an inalienable right, that everything will work itself out. And that just hasn't turned out to be the case. And we as an industry, at least in my view, have done a very poor job of telling our story to the public. And consequently, the public listens to the mainstream media, what I call the fake news media, where they make up all this stuff about the storms getting worse and more frequently. And it's just not true. But our industry has been very, very disappointing, I guess is the right word, in trying to get the real facts out.
Yeah. Do you see that they might change that they might push back against the whole demonization? It seems like they should push back hard publicly.
I do. I think that the big companies in particular who have the assets that are available to them are starting to tell their story in a little more favorable fashion. And consequently, I think that the message is getting out to the general public better than it ever has.
I mean, do you think that, like a BP, do you think they're seriously going to just get rid of hydrocarbons and try to go beyond petroleum, or are they backing off on that idea?
Well, I don't know if you've seen it recently, but the new CEO of British Petroleum is actually making a about face on their wind and solar projects and returning most of their capital to oil and gas, what they're good at and what they've been good at for their whole history. And I think the same is true of the other big companies like ExxonMobil and Chevron. They're very, very well-run companies. And their whole deal is about returning capital and to their shareholders and making a good return on their investments. And what that is investing in oil and gas and traditional forms of energy.
So as an insider, what do you think about the idea that hydrocarbons are going to run out anytime soon, or how close are we to running out?
Well, we seem to be, a friend of mine who's now deceased wrote a book called, I think it was called Twilight in the Desert, but it was about peak oil. And that has turned out not to be the case because technology just keeps improving. And consequently, we're finding crude oil and natural gas in places we never thought it possible to exist. And this whole shale revolution is nothing more than the development of new technology that allows us to crack what we used to think of as source rocks and produce those hydrocarbons, because we know the hydrocarbons are there. It's just terribly impermeable rock. And the ability to frack them and acidize them, do the different things, techniques that we do to them, we actually make really, really good wells by drilling horizontally into those source rocks.
What do you think of the idea that some of the hydrocarbons out there did not come from organic sources, that the whole abiotic hydrocarbon thing? Is there anything to that?
Well, I mean, there has been some work done on generating hydrocarbons from things like algae. And I know that's possible, but it's not, at least with the technology that we have today, is not scalable. Not to say that the technology can't be developed. But when you take things like the field in South America that ExxonMobil has discovered and is now producing, we didn't know that existed 20 years ago. But with new geophysical techniques and geological screening, they found it, and it's huge. It's the biggest discovery that I've read about in a long time.
So how about the idea, though, that some of the natural gas out there, or some of the oil even out there, it never did come from organic sources, that somehow it was created some other way? Do you have any opinion on whether that could be possible on Earth?
Well, anything's possible, but I don't believe it.
Okay. People talk about methane on Titan, out on one of the moons of, what is it, Saturn? Do you have any opinion on that, on how elsewhere in our solar system that there could be hydrocarbons that were not organic at any time?
I am not an expert on that.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Okay.
But like I said, anything is possible.
Okay.
How you would get it from Saturn, I don't know.
Good point. What do you think is a most very common misconception that the public has about your business? How about that?
Well, that's a really good question. And the answer varies widely depending on who you talk to. Take me, for instance. I didn't know anything about the energy business until I got out of college. I sort of thought that oil existed in the ground in big pools and you just had to find the big pools. I didn't know it existed in sandstone reservoirs or limestone rock, that sort of thing. I learned all about that after I went to work for Exxon. But I think back to your question about the misconceptions. A lot of people just don't understand how difficult it is to find the hydrocarbons and then what has to happen to transport them to markets where they can be refined into usable products. This gentleman, Ron Stein, makes the point that there are over 6,000 products made from crude oil in the refining process. And without those products, the world would be drastically different and less rich, I guess is the right word to say. And he talks about these people wanting to do away with oil, like Stop Oil and all those organizations. He said, it's like jumping out of an airplane without a parachute. You need to have a replacement before you want to stop something. And we don't have a replacement for crude oil right now.
Do you have any sort of a small elevator pitch about like what is fracking to explain it to people who don't know anything about fracking?
Well, yeah, we've been all over the country making presentations about what is fracking and what is the multi-stage fracking that we're using in these horizontal wells today. And the casing programs from the past were all designed to protect the freshwater sources near the surface. And the fact that we're actually producing or pumping fluid and gel into formations that are 2 miles below the surface, and there are 4 or 5 strings of casing between that horizon and the fresh water that we're drinking. People just don't understand that. And we've tried to go around and draw pictures, schematics of the well bores, and do demonstrations about how the gel is mixed and pumped and what we do with it when it comes back in the produced water, how we treat it, how we move it. So I think all of those things are useful, and people they really like learning about that, but there are some that just refuse to and think that it's a bad thing.
Do you think in a given year, commonly we are discovering more hydrocarbon deposits than we are using? Or what do you think about the pace of we're just finding new stuff? How's that going?
Well, during my 50 years in the business, that's certainly been the case. When you look at the industry as a whole, companies that are public, at least, and I'm pretty sure private companies do it the same way, but they look at what's called reserve replacement, and they pride themselves in being able to replace the reserves that they produce in every year with more than what they produce, so that their reserve replacement is greater than 1. That is a goal of most companies in this business, and for the most part, in my career, that has certainly been met. So that means, if you go through the math of all that our reserves are growing most every year. Now, I'm certain there are anomalies in there. When the price goes way down for one of the commodities that we produce, the rig count falls, and as a result, we don't discover as many new reserves. So consequently, the price of the commodity is one of the reasons it would make that not so in a given year or two.
But it is your opinion that maybe 40 years from now, we will be using more hydrocarbon fuel than we are now?
I would certainly say 20 years from now. I'm not good enough to predict that far out. But yeah, I think this industry is going to be around a long time.
As someone in oil and gas, do you have any opinion on what's happening with nuclear power or electricity, for example?
Well, and you asked me about Alex earlier.
Yeah.
He makes this point, and I certainly agree with it. We need all the energy we can get. And nuclear, the only energy that it can provide is the generation of electricity. And in my view, at least with the current technology, electricity is not a motor fuel and consequently not available for transportation of goods and people. I know that's not the case everywhere, but predominantly that is the case.
What do you think in general about the future of wind and solar power in the U.S.?
Well, going back to Warren Buffett again, those two sources of energy can't compete on a standalone basis. They have to have government subsidies in their current form in order to be economic. And if you make them compete on a standalone basis, they just will not compete with oil and gas.
One thing that I keep saying is that I'm seeing a return to sanity. It seems like over the last few years that people are asking so many questions because we've been lied to so much in recent years that people are not willing to swallow this crazy stuff as much. Are you seeing that, or how do you see it?
I am feeling that as well. I've never met this gentleman in person, but he was in your movie. His first name is Matthew, and I can't ever pronounce his last name.
Wylicki? Yeah.
Yeah. He writes a blog called Irrational Fear. And basically what he's saying is that there's lots and lots of science out there that says that carbon dioxide is not the issue. It's the proximity or lack thereof of our planet to the mother star, the sun. And that varies all over the place depending on the time of year, where you are on the earth, all kinds of variables. And mathematical models they have limitations, and the Earth's climate system is so complex, you can't accurately model it with a mathematical model. And Matthew has done a really good job of describing all of that. In fact, I just read last week about a period of time where they recorded temperatures in England all the way back into the 1600s. And there was a period of time from 1695 to like 1735 where the pace of warming actually has been greater during that period of time than it is today. And there certainly weren't any hydrocarbons being burned then.
Excellent point. You seem very plugged in. What are some of the other names of people that you read often? Like, I think you've mentioned Irina Slav and David Blackman. And who else do you read? Or whose other work do you read?
Well, I read David every day. I guess you know that David used to work and
Yes.
we used to work together. And I did a kind of a practice podcast with him getting ready for this one because I'd never done it before. So I read and listen to his stuff. I mentioned Ron Stein, Patrick Moore, who was also in your movie. I've never talked to him, but I've read his book and I love listening to him. And I mean, I love the point that he makes about we're only a few parts per million above what he calls the line of death in terms of carbon dioxide concentration. If we do away with carbon dioxide, the plants all die. People don't understand that. Do you know Scott Tinker at the University of Texas?
I don't. No. Maybe I should interview him. Yeah.
He actually was the thing I like about him is his graphics. He really has persuasive graphics about all kinds of subjects that relating to energy. And he was actually the moderator of the panel that Alex was on in Las Vegas this spring. And he did a really, really nice job.
What was the audience reception for that? Or could you tell if which side they were on or anything?
Well, All American Wildcatters is just a group of people in the oil and gas business. And so consequently, it was very positive. I didn't hear a negative thing about it.
Okay, I'm glad to hear that. Let's see, what else should I be asking you about? Or what other points would you like to make here?
Well, I would highly recommend both of Alex's books to anybody. I've probably distributed 5,000 copies of the first book. I've bought every student at Mississippi State University a copy of both books, petroleum engineering students. But I think it's very, very informative. And the reason that Alex is so persuasive is because he's not from the business. He actually has a philosophy degree from Duke. So consequently, he didn't know anything about any of this until he got to doing research in it. And as a result, he and I have become very good friends.
Do you think right now there's any stigma against students going into petroleum engineering, or that people, they're okay with it? It needs to be done.
Oh, yeah, I took Alex to Mississippi State campus year before last, and he was to give a talk, and we got these pamphlets, and we were walking in the auditorium, and it said there was these 20 students that were going to get up and walk out. There were about 200 there. All of the petroleum engineering students were there, and they got up and made some chant and walked out, and after it was over with, the petroleum engineering students all came up to me and said, "What are those people thinking?"
I think I just heard in Brian Sussman's book that he was giving a speech, and there was a whole bunch of people in the front row that were listening, and then a lot of people were turning their backs because they didn't want to hear any of it. So they made a big show of turning their backs while he was talking. It's pretty crazy.
Who was making the speech? I didn't hear.
I think it was Brian Sussman. He wrote a book called Climate Cult that I'm listening to right now. He's
okay.
Yeah. He's a very knowledgeable climate realist guy. Yeah.
I think there's several books out there that are really, really good in this space. One is by the professor of physics at, I think it's New York University. His name is Stephen Koonin.
Yes. Yeah.
And it's called Unsettled. And basically the point of the book is everybody says the 97% of scientists agree and all the science is settled. And Stephen, who was in the Obama administration, says that's just not factual. It is anything but settled. Therein lies the name of the book.
You also mentioned here you've exchanged emails with Patrick Moore, and you read his book, Confessions of a Greenpeace Dropout. I have not read that one yet, but I need to do that.
Yeah, in fact, he wasn't he on your film?
He was, yeah. He's been on my podcast too. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I didn't know all that about the formation of Greenpeace and how it started, protecting the whales and the baby seals in Canada. And I mean, it was really entertaining, and the fact that he's come all that way is pretty impressive.
One thing I like that you emailed to me is that you watched the movie several times. I enjoyed hearing that part. Yeah.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Let's see. Any other people you'd like to mention? I mean, you've run into everybody again, like you knew Walter Scott. Any other brushes with fame or any other points you'd like to bring up from your past that people might like to know about?
Well, I've met a lot of really neat people in this industry, and I tell people all the time, the business is huge in terms of dollars, but it's very, very small in terms of people. So consequently, you get to know a lot of really, really intelligent and well-meaning folks in the business. And I've had the privilege of working with and for some of them. So when I left Exxon and I went to work for a small oil and gas company in Houston called Houston Oil and Minerals, I was the 87th employee. So I went from working for one of the biggest companies in the world to just the opposite. My dad thought I was crazy. But I got a really big break. 4 months into my job there, the CEO walked into my office carrying a log and a map and said, "We just made a discovery offshore last night. And since you're the only person in this company that's ever ridden a crew boat, you get the job of developing it," because I'd worked offshore when I lived in Granholm, Louisiana for Exxon. And that for a 27-year-old kid out of college, that was a really, really good break for me.
Was that when you were spending a lot of time on a helicopter to go out to the site? Or was that a different one? Yeah.
No, actually the helicopters came when I got transferred from New Orleans, where I was a reservoir engineer, to Grand Isle, which is where their operational base for the whole Gulf of Mexico was at the time. So my job caused me to ride a helicopter most days and go to one of the platforms or more. And then I left Exxon and went to Houston, started developing this offshore field. And after we got it developed to a certain spot, then we started building helipads and riding helicopters again.
Is there any technology that is being developed right now that allows us to go back to previous oil fields and get more oil out because of better techniques? Is that happening?
Well, it's actually happening now with the shales. We're finding things like if we drill 3-mile laterals rather than 2-mile laterals and put 70 stages of frac instead of 50 stages, that we're making better wells. And we're also finding that we can go back into old wells that are depleted down to just a few barrels a day and re-stimulate them, and therefore create a brand new well out of an old well, just using newer technology.
Is there some dynamic where if you leave it for 40 years, somehow the oil seeps back in somehow, or if you go back in, there's more oil where there wasn't before, or no?
Well, the oil and gas moves around underground, that's for sure. As one of my instructors at Exxon's Reservoir Engineering School told me, that an oil and gas reservoir is nothing more than a big underground fractionating column that's been in equilibrium for 300 million years. And so consequently, when you leave something like that alone, it will actually move and change phases, and the pressures will be restored somewhat, depending on what's being injected into the ground nearby. So yes, the answer to your question is yes, there are instances where you can re-enter old oil fields and introduce a new technology like carbon dioxide flooding, for instance, to change the relative permeability of the rock and cause the rock to release more of the hydrocarbon that's captured.
So what is the furthest straight down that drills are going, or horizontally? What's the kind of a record for how far they go down, either down or horizontally?
Well, I think the deepest well vertically that's ever been drilled is like 36,000 feet. And to the best of my knowledge, I've never heard of a lateral longer than 15,000 feet. So that's 3 miles. There's a lot of talk about geothermal energy. The issue is most of the geothermal energy that we know about is really, really deep. So consequently, we don't have the technology to get all the way to it in an economic fashion. But one day we're going to develop it.
Oh, okay. I hadn't even thought of that. You think we might have a way somehow to get that energy from 30,000 feet down?
All I'm saying is that throughout the industry, throughout the history of the industry, we've tried new techniques to make the processes more efficient. And I think that's just going to continue. I mean, the metals, the alloys that we're using are stronger and stronger. The drill pipe that we're using is stronger and stronger. So consequently, I think that evolution of technology will continue both in the reservoir phase as well as the drilling phase.
Is it the Houston Museum of Natural History where they have all kinds of displays on oil technology? I saw some of that. Does that sound right? Not far from your house.
It's called the Weiss Energy Exhibit at the Houston Museum of Natural Science.
Yeah.
And there are a number of companies in the business that have been contributors and supporters of that. They actually have an exhibit. I don't know if they still have this or not, but they put you in an elevator and you can see through it, and it's like going down in a wellbore, and you see the different layers, and it's pretty unique and pretty interesting. But it's also an educational tool for school children. And I think they do a very, very nice job of teaching kids what really happens and how the oil and gas was formed in the first place.
Yeah, I think I saw some of that a few years ago, and I enjoyed the fact that I didn't see climate mentioned anywhere. They were just going, like, hey, yeah, this is how you do it. And there was nothing about we shouldn't be doing this because it's causing climate change. I like that.
That's right.
All right. Any other points you'd like to make before we go ahead and wrap up?
No, I just want to thank you for your involvement in the production of the movie. I think it's great. And as I've told many, many people I've distributed to, it's about the best I've seen.
Oh, yeah. Thanks. Yeah, Martin Durkin gets the credit for doing the interviews and writing the script and all that stuff. So thank you. Appreciate that. So I hope to talk to you again, Bobby Shackouls, but thank you very much.
Thank you.
Talk to you later. Goodbye.